Tabitha Mueller, Lucia Starbuck, two of the best election reporters in Northern Nevada, joining me in person here in the Ballot Battleground Nevada studio. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Excited to talk Nevada politics.
We always love talking Nevada politics, especially with you two. For people who might not know, Tabitha, friend of the show, because it's your second appearance
This
now.
is the second time.
Healthcare and government reporter for the Indy, and Lucia Starbuck has been on the podcast in the sense that you did that great Amadei and Greg Kidd forum that we were able to feature. Wonderful forum, by the way.
Thank you.
Political reporter at KUNR and host of the Purple Politics NV podcast. Are you guys recovered from Tuesday yet? It's we're recording on Tuesday, so a full week. Are we recovered?
Absolutely not.
No?
When you asked for an interview, I was like, oh, the election was a month ago, right? And then I was like, oh, no, it was literally last week.
I did sleep pretty much all day yesterday. And
There we
it
go.
was Veterans Day, so I think I woke up at 1 o'clock and then fell back asleep at like 6 o'clock.
Yeah. Yesterday was the first day that I felt like, okay, I kind of have my sea legs and my bearings back under me, which is good. And that's why I think this is a great conversation for today, because we have all the results now, or almost all the results, a couple more ballots here and there. We can digest them a little bit more than we could kind of in the fog of war when we're all sleep deprived and just running on cold brew and caffeine. So why don't we just start at the top? Presidential race. Top takeaways. I'm going to start with one and see what you guys think about it, which is not necessarily a hot take by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's something the Republicans learned this cycle, which is that early voting turnout actually does matter and can help you win an election. Thoughts?
It does. And I think also it can really propel people to sort of, that became the narrative in the news. If you hadn't voted and you were a Republican, maybe that urged you to go vote, right? I think that was a big part of what we saw, and especially in voters that didn't turn out, right, historically in past elections.
Lucia?
Yeah, I remember covering a J.D. Vance's first rally in Reno. That was late summer. People were already telling the crowd to vote early. So it's a message they started really early. In the past, they've cast doubt on mail-in ballots, early voting, and they just totally switched it up. And yeah, I do think it was really helpful. And I think people maybe thought, well, Dems will show up later, and that didn't quite happen.
Yeah, and looking back on it, the GOP, for people who might not know, built up, 40 or 50,000 kind of ballot lead going into Election Day. Normally, it's the GOP that's kind of fighting from behind to kind of close that gap, whereas they had this huge advantage around 4% turnout. And that started, way back at that Trump rally in Reno, and I posted about they were doing ballot collection, ballot harvesting, something they railed against for years, and now the script has flipped to where, we'll turn in your ballots for you. Go vote early. Sam Brown and Donald Trump, they were all pushing early voting. That actually does matter. It's, I think, a lesson that Democrats have known for some time, and it's probably part of the Reid Machine, right? But it does actually matter in the end.
Yeah, it feels...
Oh, go ahead.
It feels like their message was, well, if the Dems are doing it, so should we.
Yeah.
And we saw that, too, with, different events that were happening, right? There was a Trick or Trump community event that happened right before Halloween. We saw more events happening, at least in Washoe County, than we'd ever seen from the Republican Party. And not just events that were, we're going to knock doors, but we're going to engage the community in a way that Democrats have been doing in the state for a long time.
Yeah. This might be a little bit wonky for our listeners, but the way it basically works is these campaigns and all these operations, they have a list of every single voter that they think is, maybe part of their coalition. Once you vote early or vote by mail, they cross you off the list. There are fewer people to go contact, and so you can just naturally turn out more people that way when you have a smaller list. So, not a hot take. Democrats have known this for cycles. Republicans now playing on the same playing field. I imagine that will continue into the future.
The other takeaway that I was thinking about from the presidential race actually has to do with the presidential and our U.S. Senate race, which is that Trump won, but we saw that Senator Jackie Rosen held her seat. And I think what that lesson to me shows us is that we can't ride coattails.
Yeah.
Right? Just because you have a popular candidate at the top of the ticket, which is the presidential race, doesn't necessarily mean that the down ballot will follow it, because the takeaway for the presidential is people voted for Trump, but then they didn't vote down ballot, which is the real reason that Rosen won and Captain Sam Brown lost.
Yeah, how many? I mean, it was like 60 or 70,000 people, right, that voted for Trump at the top. and left it blank in the Senate race?
Absolutely. And that is, I think that's going to be an interesting cohort to follow, because will they show up in future election cycles? Or will those just be one-time voters who felt like they wanted to show up because of their support for Trump or whatever motivated them to turn out on election day?
Yeah, you can never tell me that Nevada is not purple.
Yeah.
And I mean, something similar happened in 2022 when Nevadans re-elected Democratic incumbent Senator when Nevadans re-elected Democratic incumbent Senator Catherine Cortez Masto and then kicked out Governor Steve Sisolak and chose Republican Governor Joe Lombardo. But yeah, it also tells me that voters are really focusing on issues, and the economy is a huge one, and that's why they chose Trump. His message saying, how has your life been the last 4 years? And maybe I am struggling to pay for gas, groceries. I can't get a house, or now that I do have a house, I can't afford other things. And then I think Jackie Rosen, reached a lot of people because of what she's been able to get done. I remember interviewing the Ely mayor, a lifelong Republican, but he said, you know what, Jackie Rosen picks up the phone and sometimes she even calls us first. Wow. So I think people really responded to Jackie Rosen because what she's done so far. So I think that's why you saw so many people split. And then also, not to mention how many people voted none of the above in the U.S. Senate race.
Always fascinating looking at that math. Yeah, you're like, well, if all these people had voted for this person, the result would be totally different.
Things would be changed. Well, and bouncing off of that, I think Democrats really hoped that abortion would be an issue that drove voters to cast ballots for blue candidates this year. Like what we saw in 2022, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto won with less than 1% of the vote, and she had focused her entire campaign on abortion. And I think whereas her opponent had focused it on the economy. And so I think that they were hoping that would happen again this time. Yeah. And I think maybe it's that people are feeling the pressure on their pocketbooks now more than I ever have before.
2022 was definitely the post-Roe election right after Roe v. Wade was overturned. It was the most salient issue in that election for so many people. Now, a few years removed from that, still at the top of minds for many, but evidently not enough. Circling or tying the knot, closing the loop, whatever phrase you want to use on Tabitha, your comments of, coattails don't always apply to the down ballot candidates. The rising tide of this Republican current, I think you guys referred to it as in the Indy, not a wave, but the red current, if you will, lifts all the boats, but maybe not all the boats equally, where there were some people that really benefited from this red current. And I believe Sam Brown probably did to a great extent, but not enough to get him over the top of the hump. And then one thing that your boss John Ralston said was that Sam Brown was trying to tie himself to Donald Trump in those rallies. There were so many ads where the two of them were pictured together. At the end of the day, no one else is Donald Trump.
No, and that I think will be something that Republicans have to think about in the next midterm election as well as in the future. What does galvanizing voters to turn out look like when you don't have Trump on the ticket?
Mm-hmm.
One takeaway from me, Clark County is not your father's Clark County. The Nevada Independent, you guys did some great reporting on the changing Clark County landscape. It used to be kind of a blowout for Democrats. Yes, Democrats still carried it, but by a much smaller margin than we've seen in the past. And that ended up proving to be the difference because Kamala Harris won Washoe County. And I tweeted this yesterday. In previous cycles, the prevailing wisdom was if you can win Clark, which most Democrats, all Democrats really do, and you win Washoe, you're going to win statewide. That's not the case anymore.
No, and I think what's interesting about Clark County is we saw the first Republican county commissioner elected in more than 2 decades down there.
Oh, wow.
And I think that before the county commission was completely blue, now we have one Republican commissioner, which I think shows that there is a turning of the tide. And she ran against a formidable opponent, Assemblywoman Shannon Bilbray Axelrod, who's a Democrat, well-known, the daughter of a former state legislator. Like, I think that these are all things that should have pointed to maybe Bilbray Axelrod doing better than what she did, and shows that changing tide. And nonpartisans too have become a huge part of this factor in how the counties are going to turn out. They're fast-growing voting bloc. We don't know too much about them. We can look at the turnout of these results and say that they're not solidly Democrat.
No.
And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind.
Also, the huge turnout in rural Nevada. And Ben, you mentioned, when the political parties are going down their list, you're trying to turn out each individual vote. And something that I want to mention, I don't feel that the Harris campaign paid a lot of attention to rural Nevada. I talked to the Elko Democratic Party chair, and he said, you're not going to win Elko County, but you can mitigate your losses. And I think that's something that the Harris campaign didn't really do at all. She only visited Northern Nevada once, Reno, the day on Halloween, the day before early voting was done. Of course, there's I'm a Northern Nevada girl, so like it's important to pay attention here. Lots of attention down in Southern Nevada, but I think if you're not even going at all or trying to turn out any individual votes, if you're not reaching people, if you're not showing up and saying I'm here, then you're not going to get their support.
Yeah, you look at that map from the New York Times, which shows the arrows, the red and blue arrows of which way every county went relative to 2020. And this was the story across the country, not unique to Nevada, but every single arrow in rural Nevada, I think, except for like White Pine County by like 1 point. All of them were to the right, 5 or 6 points. So there were even bigger losses in rural Nevada than what we saw Joe Biden do in 2020. Obviously, a truncated campaign for Kamala Harris, 100 some days, not time to go out to rural Nevada, but your campaign can still make efforts out there, and you're saying that they didn't do enough of that.
I think rural Nevada would have loved to see Tim Walz out there. I think he would have been a hit for sure.
Sure,
yeah. Well, and it is interesting, though, because they did do a lot of outreach to tribal communities in the state, and I think that as we get more exit polling, we'll try and see what that strategy is effective. But when you go out to those tribal communities, it's really important that you're doing both, right? You're reaching out to tribes and you're reaching out to voters in rural communities who may have voted for Catherine Cortez Masto in 2022.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Reid Machine, the vaunted, famous, infamous Reid Machine that the late Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid established, this huge political operation to turn out Democratic voters, You could look at this both ways and say, Trump flipped the state. Is the Reid Machine fail in that regard? And yet the other side of that coin is that Jackie Rosen held on by an even greater share than Cortez Masto did 2 years ago in this red wave, whatever you want to call it, election. So the Reid Machine, is it still as strong as it has been? Is it weakened a little bit?
I think the Reid Machine is still very present and still an extremely formidable force that no one should take for granted. I do think that they need to think through what the future looks like, and did the appeal for voters make sense? Yes, they held on with Senator Rosen. However, if you look down ballot and you look at our legislative races, the assembly had a supermajority in the assembly. They no longer have a supermajority. It is unlikely for the Senate. We still have one race that's not called as of the taping of this conversation, but it looks unlikely that the Senate will lose its supermajority, will gain a supermajority status. However, both of them still have majorities in each chamber. So I don't think that you can say that they have won or lost or the Reid Machine is gone, but they are at a precipice, and what they do next and what the midterm elections show will show us the strength of that machine, I think.
They flipped how many seats Republicans did? Is it just
Republicans
one or two?
flipped, I believe, one in the assembly, and they are likely to flip one in the state Senate.
So it's not some broad sweeping. They flipped a bunch of seats and flipped both. It was 2 seats here and there.
Right, 2 seats here and there with a few races not called yet. So, I'll hold off on that analysis. But I will say that it was very much what I think of as a red current, but it gives you an understanding of what might happen in the future.
I think it's also worth noting it's not like anyone blew anyone out of the water. These were a lot of these were extremely close races, which shows a very divided voting base.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Northern Nevada Congressional District 2. Lucia hosted the great forum that I referenced. We had it on the pod. Mark Amadei, entrenched longtime Republican incumbent for Nevada's 2nd Congressional District, going up against nonpartisan challenger Greg Kidd. Had a ton of money. He spent a ton of that money. And at the end of the day, the result was pretty much the same. It was a blowout in favor of Mark Amadei. My kind of takeaway from that race was Mark Amadei is well-liked in this district. It is a heavily Republican district, of course, but he is well-liked, well-respected here. And even, there was some thought maybe that trying this approach, there was no Democrat in the race, might lead to a slightly different result, and it was kind of the same thing we've seen in every cycle.
Yeah, I think Congressman Amadei has held on for a long time, and like you said, I do think that he's liked, and I think it's, again, the kind of incumbent effect. The longer that you're in, the more that voters feel like you can get stuff done. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. how I kind of view this race, and same thing with the U.S. Senate race, is this idea of how Nevadan you are. I think that's a really big deal for people here, especially if you're kind of like a small, kind of more weird, unique state. And I think that came up during Amadei versus Kidd's race. Amadei, lifelong Nevadan kid, kind of the new guy on the block. I think he was attacked for having California license plates.
Right, yeah.
Not wearing his bolo tie correctly, I think was another criticism that we saw.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think you saw the same thing in the U.S. Senate race, where this is Sam Brown. That was Sam Brown's second time running, and before that he had ran in Texas, and I saw that get brought up a lot. So I think this kind of how Nevadan are you thing really came up during that race.
The other thing I think with the Kidd Amadei race that's really important to talk about is the level of experience and expertise as well. I mean, I will say this, Amadei has been in office for a long time. And I think that voters, at least what I saw when I talked to them or with kind of scanning social media and seeing sort of responses to things, is voters sort of pointed to Kidd's money and said, well, he's a self-funded millionaire. What does he know about public land, or what does he know about some of these issues? And going back to that, how Nevadan are you? What does he know about these things? And I know some voters were single issue voters, specifically that Amadei has been against Yucca Mountain, which is the proposal to make Yucca Mountain a nuclear waste repository. And Greg Kidd was more on the fence about that. I asked him point blank, hey, would you support this proposal? And he said, well, I would make sure that we got everything we wanted from it. And so implying that he would accept it as long as Nevada got something in return. Every politician I know that has run in this state, Republican or Democrat, none of them would have said yes or even a maybe to that answer. And I think that's something that he's going to have to consider if he plans to run in 2026.
Which he did pledge to do.
Yeah.
He had his hat already made.
Yeah, right, 2026. But that ties in perfectly to the Senate race too. Sam Brown took a ton of heat. I forget, that was earlier this year, the kind of lead up to the primary, where he was, it came out from comments a few years ago that he was much more open to Yucca Mountain than you really can be in Nevada politics, to be completely honest.
Totally. And I think that is an issue that voters will stand on and say absolutely not when they're selecting a candidate. And I think that hurt both of those candidates in this election.
And to bring up abortion again, that's been really interesting, talking about what it looked like in 2022 versus now, where you saw a lot of Republicans kind of taking a back seat, no longer being super anti-abortion. You saw that, again, sorry to bring back to the U.S. Senate race, Sam Brown's wife openly talking about getting an abortion in her 20s. I pressed Amadei multiple times, would you support a national abortion ban? And he said what a lot of Republicans now are saying, well, the Nevada voters decided, because in 1990 made it a state law. He's like, I will not vote to increase or decrease any protections in that regard. So I think how abortion has played out kind of in the Republican Party has been super interesting too.
Well, and you saw with question 6, right, which was to place abortion in the state constitution up to fetal viability, which is considered anywhere from 23 to 25 weeks generally. Now, we saw that pass with overwhelming support. But again, the coattails argument, Greg Kidd ran on a platform that he would support abortion rights. That was a big part of his proposal. That was why he was running. It was a huge part of his campaign. And when voters sort of rejected that, I think they were saying it is protected under Nevada law. It will likely be protected in the Constitution. Still needs to go through one more election cycle. And there's another proposal separately going through the state Senate and the legislature. But I think that voters are seeing those as sort of two separate issues now.
Yeah.
And I think there's been an interesting disconnect too with, and that's something that we also saw across the country. There's kind of this, what media is saying now is that abortion won where Harris didn't. In several states, including I believe Arizona as well, where a ballot question to increase access to abortion passed where Harris did not. And I think there's a disconnect with voters saying, I think, Tabitha, you did that story where that poll said even a majority of Republicans don't support outlawing abortion. But I think some voters are taking Trump at his word, saying that he's not going to do a national abortion ban, or they maybe are not connecting how he chose the Supreme Court Supreme Court justices who did overturn Roe v. Wade. So I kind of think there's like a really interesting disconnect where people did vote to put abortion in the state constitution and then also voted for Trump.
Or that voters don't see that as an issue that can be taken away from them if it's protected
Sure.
at the state level. I think there's, like you said, a disbelief in this sort of idea of a national abortion ban.
Yeah, especially when we see, I brought this up with a source earlier, when we see marijuana being illegal at the federal level, but you can still do it here in Nevada. But I was like, so what's up with that? So there's not like an enforcement, but there could be an enforcement. But yeah, I think the disconnect from the federal versus being protected at the state is coming into play.
Let's talk about the process and whether some of Nevada's laws around elections might be changed, or there will be efforts probably in 2025 in the legislature to change those laws. It's a conversation we have every cycle. There was a lot of talk leading up to this election. It's going to be better this time. It's going to be faster. We had VREMS, which we've talked about a million times, voter registration electronic management system, top-down voter registration, new ballot sorter in Washoe County. All these, they could start counting a little bit earlier
new
on
guidance
election
on the
day.
counting.
And perhaps that helped on the margin some. At the end of the day, it's still Thursday, Friday of election week, and Nevada has not been called by a lot of the major outlets in the Senate race or in the presidential race. You see 48 states are lit up dark blue, dark red. Nevada and I think Arizona were not. And so there's still kind of a lot of criticism and negative attention on the Silver State. Do you guys think something will be able to be changed in the democratically controlled legislature next year? Because, and I'll point out too, Secretary of State San Francisco Aguilar, a Democrat, was really frustrated with this. He did an interview on our station where he said Nevadans deserve better.
I actually was going to point that out. I think that because he wants to change it, and Republicans and Governor Joe Lombardo has indicated that he would like to see a way of increasing that turnout of results. I think that that's something that will likely happen, or we'll see lawmakers try and address during the legislative session. I would add a note, though, that when you look at Nevada's election laws, what is very interesting to me is there are a million different ways to vote, right? You can vote by mail. You can vote early. We have ease for people living overseas, and I lived overseas and used it, and it's a great system. And you can vote by drop-off on election day. In a lot of ways, that is allowing voters with disabilities, that's allowing voters who have maybe trouble getting to the polls, or, it gives them a whole plethora of ways to cast a ballot and ensures that their vote are counted. Now, if we reduce, say, the mail-in deadlines, or you change deadlines, or you change, someone with ADHD might not remember to mail in their ballot if it's required to be mailed in 3 days before election day, right? Like, those are all issues that lawmakers are going to have to navigate as they're processing this. How do we speed up the return of results without infringing on people's access to the ballot?
Yeah, Democrats being in control, we know how they feel generally about ballot access and voter access when it comes to issues like voter ID and the like. And so I think they'll be naturally pretty resistant to some of these. But with Cisco Aguilar coming out and saying this was a bad process, essentially, maybe there's some movement there. One thing about, right now it's you got to be postmarked by election day. Do you think there's any appetite for moving that up to say, a lot of states have this, it has to be delivered by election day, your mail ballot?
I think for that conversation, people are really freaked out, especially with that proposed moving of the mail services to California. I think you saw that come up with the attempted lawsuit to make it so ballots would have to be postmarked by election day. That people don't want to rely on the mail potentially messing up and then getting discounted that way. I think that's a really big fear, especially with how close we got to having our mail go outside of the state. I think people are kind of wary of that and not wanting to rely on the post service to make sure votes are in an appropriate time. And yeah, speaking of Secretary Aguilar, he's been a Democrat who said, I didn't know if I won until the next couple of days when he first ran. But to push back against it a little bit, I mean, to me, I think the process is working as it's supposed to according to the deadlines. We're recording this on Tuesday. People still have until 5 p.m. today to signature cure their ballots.
Right.
So if their signature didn't match up right now, it has not been counted, and they have until today to do so. So if you're, and then, the with mail-in ballots being allowed to be accepted 3 days not postmarked, 4 days postmarked, these processes are in place, like Tabitha said, to make sure people's votes are counted. If maybe you mailed in your ballot, it's like, okay, I'm done. Now I'm going to go back to work or my extremely busy life, and the political party's trying to call you or your county's trying to call you. to give voters appropriate space to make sure that their vote is counted. I think it's working like it's been set up to. And then you saw, huge results being posted as soon as polls closed. So counties were allowed to, I think, start scanning ballots 15 days before, and I forgot what they're allowed to do day of.
They could start to tabulate at 8 a.m. on
Okay.
election day.
And then their first batch is sent to the Secretary of State before the polls close. So on election night, we saw early voting and then all the valid mail-in ballots. That was a huge dump of results on election night. So it feels very slow, but the way the deadlines are, I feel like it's maybe working like it's supposed to.
Yeah, that's a great point. One thing that Aguilar did allude to was, and you guys might know more about this, how it went down in Clark County, but it sounded like he was being a little critical of Clark County for not knowing how many mail ballots they actually had on hand, and then not processing those mail ballots that they did have in-house on the same day, and saying, essentially we'll get to those tomorrow. He was alluding to maybe changing the guidance, or maybe it's a change of state law to where you have to process and tabulate all the ballots you have in-house on the same day that you get them, and you can't just say, we're all tired. And the workers do a very thankless job. They work incredibly long hours, and maybe it's an issue of more staff probably not working those staff harder, but you don't get to go home until all the ballots you have on that day are counted.
Well, and I think that's the question that you kind of have to analyze is it more resources that are needed? Is it more funding? Is this, like you were saying, Lucia, is this a problem with our deadlines and how they're established? But again, you have to weigh voters' access to the ballot box and the realities of the state that we're in, right? We don't have a huge budget as a state, right? We rely a lot on gaming industry revenue. We don't have an income tax here. I think that those are all concerns that lawmakers are going to have to weigh when they're looking at addressing this particular issue.
Yeah, when we talk about staff and resources, I believe the Washoe County Registrar of Office has 19 staff members that do elections. I know they're pulling people from the health district and other departments. So yeah, I mean, how late do you want your staff working 24 hours every day leading up to the election? That's going to burn people out.
Definitely, and there's already been so much turnover in those departments. So let's wrap up a little bit with ballot questions. The big one for me, we on this show and at my station, ton of focus on question 3, open primaries, ranked choice voting. Failed in Nevada, but it failed all over the place. Politico did a story saying 7 different states, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, South Dakota, and here in the Silver State. The only place that a ranked choice voting effort succeeded was in Washington, D.C. And so it just really seems like there is not an appetite. People are unhappy with the system that we have, and yet still pretty unwilling to vote to try something else that might be scary.
Go ahead.
Sorry. And I think it's looking like it's going to be repealed in Alaska as well.
Right, yeah, that's as of this recording, I think they had 80% of the vote in, and repeal was ahead by a point or a point and a half.
Well, I was going to say I spoke to Sandra Cosgrove, who is a professor at College of Southern Nevada, does a lot of voting rights work. And she had actually been a volunteer with this campaign. And I sort of asked her what had happened or, why, because it passed in 2022. And a slim margin, I think it was about 6 percentage points that it passed by. But she said that there was a national campaign that sort of took over here in Nevada and that took over in other states. And that national group sort of came in with their messaging and didn't use a ground up framework. And we saw the national campaign really focus on open primaries, less so on ranked choice voting. And I think that voters might have been confused. I think that there was a lack of understanding maybe of the topic, but also that there was a sense that it was disingenuous because of how it was being presented. And I know that the group and the organization has said they want to keep fighting for this. They will likely petition the legislature to pass open primaries because Democrats said they would be open to that because if it was separate from this ranked choice ballot measure. So I think
legislative Democrats said that?
That's what Sandra Cosgrove told me is that, and we saw even that there was criticism of the ranked choice voting element of it, but less criticism of that open primaries. Now, I don't think the Democrats would still be excited about open primaries, neither would Republicans, but we did see we saw fewer attacks against that portion of the proposal.
Yeah, even in our debate, the people that were fighting against against this measure, question 3 said, yeah, we don't really have that much of a problem with open primaries. Anecdotally, reading through Facebook comments and stuff, a lot of people are like, yeah, I support open primaries, not ranked choice voting. So perhaps this kind of comes back in a much more limited sense.
I also talked to shout out to Sandra for answering our questions always about ballot question 3. I also think there was just really, really negative campaigning against question 3. I think there was a billboard in Reno that was like, I think it was Halloween themed.
It was trick
Oh,
or
yeah,
it was the
yeah.
trick one. Yeah.
It's not a
It's not a
Treat,
treat, it's a trick.
Yep.
Yeah.
but yeah, I think people are much more excited about open primaries, you know, with more people registered as nonpartisans in the state than both Democrats and Republicans. I remember talking to nonpartisans in June, they felt extremely disenfranchised not being able to participate fully in races where and other than outside of nonpartisan races, so they couldn't vote for Democrats or Republicans. And I said, like, oh, would you do same-day registration? Would you switch your registration? They're like, that goes against everything I believe in. That's why I'm a nonpartisan. So, yeah, I think lots of more excitement around open primaries, but just complete, like, I call it, like, bipartisan hate toward question 3.
Yeah.
In 2022, there was no opposition spending,
Yeah,
and it still barely passed by 6 percentage points. This year, we saw before the fourth quarter, so there's still money that still has to be come in. We still need to look at campaign finance reports, at least $2 million. Now, granted, $2 million to $12 million because the supporters spent, I think, $12 million on ads, which is wild to me, just a huge amount of money. But likely, we'll probably see about $10 million in spending from the opposition. They spent money, and it turned out in favor of them.
Did, yeah. Hyper local issue here, but since we're all Washoe County residents, Washoe County ballot question 1 to extend the tax override to direct, 2 cents of every $100 of assessed property value to the library system failed by, by 4 or some odd percentage points, could potentially create this huge budget shortfall for the Washoe County library system. Takeaways from that, mine was that just reading it back, it's our job to understand these measures, and we read them very closely and try and explain them to the best of our abilities, but maybe voters didn't understand. It was a very confusing question.
I think if you put something about taxes on the ballot, people are going to say no.
Yeah, just a reflexive no, I don't want to vote for that. And it only passed by I think a 0.1% the first time in 1990.
And
or
something
1994.
Sandra has said too that those questions are written by lawyers, so you kind of like try to mitigate your potential getting sued later down the road. So they are extremely confusing, and I think something similar happened in Elko where it was a tax that went toward the school board. It got put on the ballot. People were like, well, it was already an existing tax. People were like, well, why would I vote for this? It got struck down, and now the school board is struggling to do infrastructure upgrades. So I think if you put tax on the ballot, why would I vote for that?
And I think that when we were looking at this ballot measure, I think there's also, along with the lack of understanding, because we've seen that from responses, people didn't know what it meant, they didn't know what it did. People don't pay attention to local races as much as they do top of the ticket ones, right? You start getting down and you start getting ballot fatigue, right? Yeah. And I've talked with some consultants about this. Like, voters don't understand, and mailers, text messages, that will ring through, but we didn't see that many mailers.
There was not a ton of money spent in support of this.
Or advocacy until the end. Yeah. And the other piece is we've seen our libraries be attacked as part of culture wars, right? Sure. Carly Savageau did some really good reporting for the Indy, and then we've also seen reporting in the RGJ, the Reno Gazette-Journal, some other outlets as well, yours included. But we've seen that people have been critical of the library system. They've been critical of books that have been there, programs, all sorts of different activities that happen. And maybe this, too, was a backlash to some of that as well. I don't know. I don't have any polling, but I think that has to be a part of the conversation and sort of what we're seeing nationally as part of this, I'll put quotes around it, culture wars.
Sure, yeah. One last takeaway from me, and then I'll ask if you guys have any that I've missed, which is that President Trump won the state. He won all the swing states. He's going to be our next president. And yet, at least still here on the local level, election denialism from some conservatives, not all, is still out there. We saw, prominent election denier Robert Beadle saying the race was rigged against Sam Brown. You would kind of hope that by virtue of Trump winning that this would kind of kill this election denialism, and that hasn't happened here. Presumably on Friday when they canvassed the vote, there's going to be an effort to tell commissioners not to certify the results, and so election denialism still out there. Any takes on that?
Ooh.
I think it's definitely still out there, but it's hard when your candidate wins. I think there was a huge drop-off of claims of false elections after Trump was kind of declared the winner. You saw that in the U.S. Senate race. Sam Brown putting a message essentially saying, don't stop the count. And then even like in the state Republican Party, I think some were trying to claim of election rigging, and then you saw like Sigal Chattis going on and saying, no, they're doing it like they're supposed to. So even kind of infighting within the Republican Party. But it's really hard to claim election fraud because then what? So then Trump didn't actually win? And I mean, the same thing happened in 2022. So what? Lombardo didn't actually win?
Right.
Yeah, nervous to see what happens with the canvas of the vote. You have, Gene Herman vowing to almost never certify elections. Right. When Secretary Aguilar tried to bring this up with the Supreme Court over the summer, they decided not to take it up. But literally in the court document, they said repetition is likely. So it's I think a big question of what's going to happen during that canvass.
Yeah, I think Lucia put it really well, and so did you. If you were going to manipulate the election, why would you make the presidential candidate win? And also, why would you lose supermajorities in the state house? And why would you lose congressional district 2? I think that the split ticket voting that you see is indicative of Nevada's purple status. I think you see it as indicative that voters cast their ballots and we have the cards that we have. And it was done in a way where we didn't see widespread fraud.
Absolutely.
I think it helps propel question 7 for voter ID. I think Nevadans felt that was a way to ensure the integrity of elections. I think that really helped that ballot question.
Anything else that I'm leaving out here? Things you got to get off your chest or takeaways that I didn't get to?
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I feel like
I'm
we
so
got
biased
to
against the
so
other
much
ballot
of
questions
it.
because I just love them so much.
Well, all of the ballot questions, to Lucia's point, I would say all of the ballot questions were really interesting and how voters cast for them, right? One that I was watching was the removing slavery from the state constitution. Mm-hmm. I think it was overwhelmingly voted against in rural counties. Wow. And then our urban counties supported it. So that I thought was kind of an interesting takeaway for me, at least, was watching where the support for that came from and where the rejection came from as well.
I believe something like that failed in California.
It did, yeah.
And I know a big question of kind of like, now that it has passed, kind of what does that mean for prison labor? And I think that's going to be something that's taken up during the 2025 legislative session as well. Mm-hmm. Another shout out to the ballot question, ballot question 5. If you're a parent with young children, if you're a parent with young children, Ben said he's entering the potty training age. Starting January 1st, you will not have sales tax on diapers.
And it was reminiscent of the tax on women's feminine products, right? Yep. We removed that. Mm-hmm. I think it was 2022 that went away.
Something like that, yeah, for sure. Well, that's a good segue, Lucia, or you guys mentioned potentially bills having to deal with prison reforms and things like that in the 2025 legislature. So we will see you guys in Carson City not that long from now in February when this legislature begins. What do you guys do to kind of decompress now that it's all over? Lucia, you went on a hike this weekend, right?
Yes, saw some good fall colors.
Good, wonderful.
I've just been sleeping, but I think I'm really looking forward to the holidays, and I like baking and hanging out with friends and family and hiking as well.
Read a million books over the holidays.
Books. Also, I love a good terrible TV show. I've been binge watching Suits lately. I
need to start that. It's been on my list.
It's
my
a
Netflix
fun
list forever.
Yeah, it's a fun, like, low stakes. Just I can enjoy some legal banter and not have to think about life.
See, I haven't even gone to a drama. I've been watching like Tim Robinson or like
fair.
Seinfeld, like just like comedy only. So.
I was watching Psych recently for that same reason. I was like, I just need something lighthearted and fun. Yeah.
I'm almost sad it's over, but I know that's a very unpopular opinion. The election.
A little bit, yeah. It's our Super Bowl, you know.
Yes.
We love it, but then we also need a break. So.
Yes.
Tabitha, Lucia, wonderful conversation with the both of you guys. We will see you down in Carson City for the legislature. Until then, get some rest, recover from the election, and thank you both very much. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.